So here's the question. How many of you follow the directions when you open the box and you pull them out, and how many just ignore them? How many follow directions? All right. And who ignores the directions? All right. At least you're honest. I have done both. And usually I discover that there's a reason you follow the directions, because everything has to go together in a certain way. And if you don't put it together in just the right way, you get to a point where you can't get it together and you have to take everything apart and start all over. Because we didn't follow directions. But if we follow the directions and we do it the way we're supposed to, when we get to the end, we have this joy and satisfaction that we have the finished product that we're looking for, whatever that is. The finished product. The goal is reached. And we discover that it all works the way it's supposed to work, following the directions that we get. As we think about following directions, spiritually, sometimes we have the same problem, following directions that God gives us. In 2 Kings chapter 5, there's a story of a man who also struggled with following directions, but when he finally does follow the directions, he discovers something amazing in his life. And so in 2 Kings chapter 5, we are introduced to a man named Naaman. Now Naaman, verse 1, was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Naaman was a man who needed help. He had a problem. He was a great man. He was a military leader for the king of Aram, or Syria. They were opponents of Israel, enemies of Israel in many ways. They had this on-again, off-again relationship. Sometimes they were at battle, sometimes they were not, but they kind of had this tension that was going on all the time. He is a military soldier, a Gentile, non-Jewish, for an enemy of Israel, highly regarded. And the Lord, it's interesting, the Lord had given him victory. The Lord has blessed his efforts in his battles. But he has this problem. He has leprosy. There's a lot of discussion among the scholars exactly what kind of leprosy he had. Most people think he did not have the worst kind of leprosy because he hasn't really isolated himself from the community. He's still with people, so he's not got this highly contagious form of leprosy. But leprosy was a broad term that related to all kinds of different skin diseases. And so he had something, obviously, that people knew he had, and he knew he had it, and it was obviously something that was uncomfortable or something that was a problem, and so he wanted to get rid of this leprosy. He had this, and he couldn't get rid of it. None of the cures that they had of their day, none of the medical people of their day, nobody could figure out how to get rid of his leprosy. So he needs help. And in comes a young girl who God will use to help him. God uses this young Israelite servant girl to come to his rescue. Verse 2. Now bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." As I thought about this young servant girl, I had several thoughts about what's taking place here. This young servant girl who serves Naaman's wife has the answer for him. If only he would go to the prophet in Samaria, in the land of Israel. If he would only go to the prophet, God's prophet who's living in Samaria, he could cure him. she has this tremendous faith in God, that God has the ability to cure him. And not just cure him, but think about what's happening here. She has faith that God would even cure a Gentile. Her God is the God of Israel. The people of Aram are her enemies. But she reasons that God could even cure this Gentile man who's not part of Israel. And then as I thought more about her, I thought, I wonder what it was like for her. She is a young girl who lives in Samaria, in the Israelite areas. An Israelite, one of God's chosen people, and she has been taken captive. Basically has become a servant or a slave to Naaman and his family and his wife. She is their servant, ripped from her home, ripped from her homeland, and hauled off to a foreign place to serve people she doesn't know. How would you feel if you were her? And would you be inclined, if you were her, to help Naaman? Or might there be a little grudge, maybe some resentment that you might have? Might you reason in your mind, why should I help him? He's taken me from my homeland. He's hauled me off to this place. But there's no evidence she has any of those thoughts. She has compassion for Naaman. Says, I have an answer. God can take care of it. Maybe that says something about Naaman and his wife and how well they treated their servants and the people who were in their care. And they reciprocated by wanting to help. But God uses this girl to connect with Naaman to help cure him. We all have needs. There's people all around us have needs. And sometimes God wants to use us. He wants to use us as that person to help someone else, just like he's using this girl to help Naaman. So Naaman gets the word. The story continues in verse 4. Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. By all means go, the king of Aram replied. I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 sets of clothing. It's a pretty extravagant gift. A lot of gold and silver and clothes. Verse 6, the letter that he took to the king of Israel read, with this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy. Verse 7, as soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes. And he said, am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me. The king of Israel is not too happy about this whole situation. Here comes Naaman. Here's the letter. He reads the letter and he says, am I God? Can I bring people back to life after I've had them killed? Why are you coming to me? But probably the king of Aram had reasoned that the prophet was in Samaria, and so he would be under the king's rule, and that the king probably would send him the prophet. Maybe that was in his mind. But the king of Israel wants to have no part of this. And he thinks it's a trap. This is just a trap, so you're going to have a reason to attack me and to come against us again, and I don't want to have any part of this. But the word leaks out that Naaman has come. Verse 8. And when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message, why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. He will know that there is a prophet in Israel. Keep those words in mind. There is this goal that Elisha has. The ultimate goal is that Naaman will know that there is a prophet in Israel, that he will know that there is one true God, and it's the God of Israel. He will know. Reminds me of the Exodus stories where God did all of these different things in Exodus so that the people would know, especially the Egyptians, that they would know that he was the true God. He will know that there is a prophet in Israel. And so Naaman went. He went with his horses and his chariots, and he stopped at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha, the prophet, Elisha sent a messenger to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Naaman gets to Elisha's house. Elisha never comes out to see him. He sends a messenger out. He says, "Now here's what you need to do. You go down to the Jordan River, and you go wash yourself 7 times. Dip 7 times in the river, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." It's interesting how he breaks that up. We'll come back to this in just a second. There's more going on here than just him physically being healed. He says, your flesh will be restored, or you will be physically healed. And then he adds, and you will be cleansed. The physical healing will be evidence of a internal cleansing that may happen. There's more that's happening here than just physical healing. Even though Naaman probably doesn't get that. He doesn't understand it. But here's the problem with Naaman. Naaman's pride gets in his way. Look what he does. His response to all of this in verse 11. But Naaman went away angry, and he said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. And are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and he went off in a rage. Naaman has this idea. He is a military commander. He has power. He has influence. He's offended. He's offended. He's angry that Elisha would just send out a messenger. Why Elisha doesn't even come out himself and greet him. He sends someone else out. He says, he could have come out and he could have waved his hand and it could have been this fancy miracle and everybody would have seen it and it would have been stupendous and great and amazing and everybody would have oohed and awed. He wanted to show. And yet it's this little simple thing. Yeah, you just need to go down the River Jordan and dip 7 times. And then as he thinks about that, he thinks, why the River Jordan? It is a dirty, nasty river. Why Jordan? We got nice rivers back at home in Damascus. We could go up there. Nice, clear streams where you can see the fish swimming around, not the muddy Jordan. His pride gets in the way. This isn't what he wanted. It's not how he wanted it. He wanted a show. He wanted extravagance. He wanted to talk to the prophet himself. He wanted all of this. And he gets a simple request from God. He gets directions. He gets that direction sheet and said, this is what you need to do. And do it this way. And he wants to skip the directions and do it his own way. But we are a lot like him. We are a lot like him. We don't always want to do things God's way. We want to skip the directions and do it ourselves. We want to ignore what God says and do it some other way. Or God gives us a command to go out and do something. We know how we're supposed to live, and yet we want to put limits and barriers on it. We'll come back to that in just a second. The servants of Naaman intervene, and they come to him and say, "What are you doing, Naaman?" Verse 15. Or actually, verse 13, 13. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he tells you, wash and be cleansed?" Like, Naaman, think about it. If God wanted to do some great thing, you wouldn't have hesitated. You would have just done it. You want to be healed. You want this leprosy gone. Why don't you just go down to the river and dip and see what happens? What's the worst that can happen, Naaman? You might be healed. The leprosy might disappear. They begin to reason with him a little bit, thinking, "What are you doing?" Verse 14, and so he went down and he dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. His flesh is restored. His skin is like that of a young boy. Imagine that. You see all these commercials on TV, use these products and your skin will look like a 20-year-old again. Naaman doesn't have to do that. He just has to dip 7 times in the Jordan River. It's like he's gone back 30 years. His skin looks like that of a young boy. Everything is great. And Naaman's, in his obedience, he discovers the one true God. It's when he finally obeys the directions that he discovers the amazing truth of who God is. Verse 15, and Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God, and he stood before him and he said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." This is his confession of faith. Now I know there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Naaman lives in Aram, Syria. He lives in an area where they have lots of gods, gods for everything. They worship other gods. He's probably grown up learning that the God of Israel has no power. He's even defeated Israel in battle. He had other gods. But in this moment, remember the words of Elisha. He will know that there's a prophet in Israel. He will know. And now he comes back and says, "I now know that there is only one God, and it is the God of Israel." This is his conversion moment, if you will, this moment when he comes to the realization that everything about this God is true and he needs to listen to him. And then he goes on, and the prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." When he offers him the gift, "I will not accept a thing." Even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master, the king, enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." And Elisha said, "Go in peace." Obedience. He discovers you got to follow the directions. There was something significant. Let's go back to the Jordan. Now, he didn't want to go to the Jordan. It's this muddy, dirty river in Israel. I got rivers up in Damascus that look good. But what he's discovering is that God is in Israel with those people, the chosen people of God, the Israelites. There's something significant about the Jordan. The Jordan is the river they crossed to get over that God had parted, remember? The Jordan held significance for God's people. It was centuries later, Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. John was baptizing people in the Jordan River. There's significance with the Jordan because it's in Israel, and that's where God is. He had to realize that. He's the Gentile. He has to come to God's people. He has to realize that God is here. Follow the directions. But not just that, get the request. I want to take back with me as much dirt as I can get these 2 mules to carry. I can just picture him. He's got his 2 mules hooked up to a trailer, and they're shoveling in dirt from Israel. Dirt. Why? Why dirt from Israel? Why are you taking, they got dirt in Damascus. Why dirt? Because he says, I want to offer sacrifices only to the Lord God. I want to offer sacrifices only to the Lord God. He's going to take the dirt back to his house in Damascus. He's going to dump it all in his yard. He's going to build an altar. He's going to offer sacrifices to God. You could only offer sacrifices in Israel, in the places that God had set up. But he didn't live in Israel, but he wants to worship God. So he's going to take Israel with him. And in order to do that, he needed dirt from Israel so he could put Israel in his backyard and put the altar there, and then he could worship God. He is a changed man. He's come to believe, and as he's obeyed God, he has discovered who God is, and he is so excited about this. I want to worship God and only the one true God, and I want to have sacrifices there. And I can't come here, but I will take Israel to me, and I will build an altar, and I will offer sacrifices to the one God in a foreign land on Israel's soil that's in my yard. And he has one more request. He says, and please, God, forgive me. Give me forgiveness, because I'm going to have to take the king to the temple of Rimmon. And he's old and feeble, and when he bows down, I'm going to have to help him. Please forgive me when I bow down to this God who I don't believe in, but I have to do this. Elisha says, go in peace. Naaman, in his obedience, discovers who God is. He has to follow all the directions to get there, and then he realizes who God is. And he is amazed. And he is changed in his behavior, in his actions, in his mind, in his heart. Every part of him has changed because he sees who God is. But to get there, he had to do what God said. So what about us today? God tells us all these things that we should do. Sometimes we want to change them. Sometimes we want to look at them and think, that's not really necessary. God wants us to be baptized, and sometimes we think, I don't really need to do that. God's going to save everybody. Doesn't really matter. And yet over and over in the New Testament, God commands people to be baptized. And it's in baptism that we discover cleansing from God. Not that we're doing anything special. We're just trusting and obeying God that his promises will be fulfilled. Naaman is healed physically of his leprosy, but he is cleansed in his heart. He's cleansed in his heart as he comes before God. But we also, in other ways, want to change what God says. We want to put limits and barriers. We don't want to just completely obey God. We want to do it our way sometimes. There's all these examples in the New Testament I was thinking about how times where God challenges people to do things, but we don't really want to go there. as God's people sometimes. And yet we are forced sometimes to step out of our comfort zone and completely obey God. To serve someone in a way that might make us a little uncomfortable. And in that we discover a new joy and a satisfaction and a truth about God. Remember, God talks about the Good Samaritan. Jesus does. The Good Samaritan. Who's my neighbor? Jesus says, your neighbor is the person that's in need. It's not the person you think of. You have this little closed group of neighbors. He says, no, your neighbor is anybody out there who has need. But when we serve them and go out of our comfort zone, then we discover a new joy and satisfaction. Maybe we must show love and patience to someone who is not our friend, but as Jesus said, our enemy. Or that person who gets on our nerves or our personalities clash. And maybe it's in that moment we discover that God can change our hearts and the other person's heart also. We might just be getting a glimpse of the character and the nature of God like we've never seen before. Or maybe it's stepping out of our comfort zone so we can invite or share Jesus with someone else and discover the immense mercy and grace of God that can change lives. Jesus wrestled with the Pharisees who had this very narrow view of who should be saved. They complained as he sat there and he ate dinner with the tax collectors and the sinners. And Jesus saying they need the kingdom. They need forgiveness. But sometimes we are like that. We want to draw these barriers. We don't want to be all in. We want to serve the people who are comfortable for us. We want to love the people who are our friends, but not our enemies. We want to share Jesus with the people that we know and we're comfortable with, that we want in our church, but not realizing there might be other people that God is bringing into our lives that need Jesus. And He wants you and I to be the servant girl who shares it with them. And it's only when we step out of our comfort zone and we fully obey God, sometimes pushing ourselves to limits that we haven't discovered before. It's then, like Naaman, we discover things about God that we never knew before, and things about our own life. And we begin to see how God can shape us and mold us and change us and make us the people He wants us to be. To obey without any limits or any barriers, just to read what God says and just to live it out. To follow the directions. And so the next time you open a box and you pull out the directions, wrong directions, the directions, next time you pull these out, think about the story of Naaman. And think about what God is telling us. To just follow directions. Just obey Him. Just do what He wants. And trust Him. Because when we get to the other side, after we have done this, we will discover and be amazed at who God is. And who we are when we are shaped and molded by God. So as you go this week, focus on serving God. Just obeying Him. Focus